your basement burglar report. There's been new urgency in the community. There's been a basement burglar going around terrorizing homes by entering through the basement windows. So he's been called the basement burglar because his habit is breaking the window, reaching through the window, unlocking the door, coming inside, causing chaos and confusion. Fear is spreading through the community. So the burglary experts have come up with a plan where if one would just simply place concertina wire inside the basement window, the burglar cannot reach through, unlock the window, and come in and cause problems. The police department has an adequate supply of the wire for everyone in the community. If you come out, pick up the concertina wire, they will even help you install it if you need it. So the restoration of our community can be accomplished simply by picking up the concertina wire, installing it in your home. Assistance will be provided if necessary. Contact your police department immediately, get this installed, and let's get things back to normal. Thank you. Good evening.
Please understand that this is an analogy. It's an allusion to describe the status of COVID-19 in our community. COVID-19 is the basement burglar. There's no real person breaking into people's basements. But COVID-19 is costing us lives, it's costing us family unity, it's costing us the function of our community, it's costing us. And so finding a way to put some concertina wire inside the window to keep the COVID-19 out seems like a great idea to me. And I know some people are reluctant. So today we're going to share some information about the history of vaccination and help you make your decision about whether you want to get vaccinated.
Variolation was the method of inoculation that was first used to immunize people against smallpox. Variolation was done with material taken from a pustule of a patient who either had active smallpox or had been recently variolated. They would take the dried or powdered scabs from the sores or the pus from the sores, and they would dry it, grind it up into a powder, and they would rub that powder onto scratches in the skin. Or the records show that the Chinese nurses, their method was to blow this powder up into the noses of their patients. This was how they put the concertina wire inside the window to keep the smallpox out. This was done in the hope that a mild but protective infection would result from this small exposure to a weakened version of the item that was causing the contagion, smallpox. The notes state that this was first used in China, India, and the Middle East before Northern Europe, England, and North America found out about it. But let's talk about when it came to the United States. There was a lot of opposition when it first was tried here, and let's talk about that story. The news was terrifying to colonists in Massachusetts. Smallpox had made it to Boston and was spreading rapidly. The first victims, passengers on a ship from the Caribbean, were shut up in a house identified only by a red flag. That flag said, "God have mercy on this house." Meanwhile, hundreds of residents of the bustling colonial town had to flee for their lives, terrified of what might happen if they were exposed to the frequently deadly disease, smallpox. They had reason to fear. The virus was extremely contagious, spreading like wildfire. Smallpox patients experienced fever, fatigue, and a crusty rash that could leave ugly scars. Up to 30% of those people died. But the smallpox epidemic was a different kind than any that came before it. As the sickness swept through the city, it was killing hundreds. But there was an enslaved man known only as Onesimus. He suggested a way to keep people from getting sick. Intrigued by Onesimus's idea, a brave doctor and an outspoken preacher undertook a bold experiment to try to stop smallpox in its tracks. 15 years earlier, this enslaved West African man was purchased for the prominent minister. His name was Cotton Mather. His congregation purchased a slave for him. I'll say it again. His congregation purchased a slave for the preacher. Mather gave him the name Onesimus, after an enslaved man in the Bible whose name meant useful. Mather had been a powerful figure in the Salem witch trials before that. He believed that owners of enslaved people had a duty to convert these enslaved people to Christianity and educate them. But like other white men of his era, he looked down on what he called the devilish rights of the Africans and worried that enslaved people might openly rebel. Mather didn't trust Onesimus. He wrote about having to watch him carefully due to what he thought was thievish behavior, and he recorded in his diary that he was wicked and useless. But in 1716, 5 years before the smallpox epidemic showed up, Onesimus told him something that he did believe. Onesimus told him that he knew how to prevent smallpox. Onesimus, who was a pretty intelligent fellow, Mather wrote, told him he had smallpox and then hadn't. Onesimus said that he had undergone an operation which had given him something of the smallpox and would forever preserve him from it, and whoever had the courage to use it were forever free of the contagion. The operation Onesimus referred to consisted of rubbing pus from an infected person into an open wound on the arm. Once the infected material was introduced into the body, the person who underwent that procedure was inoculated against smallpox. It wasn't a vaccination, but it did activate the person's immune system and allowed them to develop protection against the disease most of the time. Mather was fascinated. He verified Onesimus' story with that of other enslaved people and learned that the practice had also been used in Turkey and China. He became an evangelist for inoculation, also known as variolation, and spread the word throughout Massachusetts and elsewhere in the hopes that it would prevent smallpox. But Mather had not bargained for how unpopular this idea would be. Sounds kind of familiar? The same prejudices that caused him to distrust his servant made other white colonists reluctant to undergo a medical procedure developed by or for black people. Mather was vilified. The New England Courier, the newspaper, ridiculed him. An explosive device was thrown through his window with an angry note, kind of like preparing for Martin Luther King one day, huh? There was an ugly racial element to the anger. Religion also contributed to the anger. Other preachers argued that it was against God's will to expose his creatures to dangerous diseases. But in 1721, when the smallpox epidemic hit, Mather and Zabdiel Bolson, the only physician in Boston who supported the technique, got their chance to test the power of inoculation. That year, the smallpox epidemic spread from the ship to the population of Boston, sickening about half of the city's residents. Boylston sprang into action, inoculating his son and his enslaved workers. Then he began inoculating other Bostonians. Of the 242 people he inoculated, only 6 died. That's a rate of 1 in 40, as opposed to 1 in 7 deaths among the people who were not inoculated. The smallpox epidemic wiped out 844 people in Boston, over 14% of the population. But it yielded hope for the future epidemics. It also helped to set the stage for vaccination. That was in 1721. In 1796, Edward Jenner developed an effective vaccination that used cowpox to prevent smallpox. This is where the name vaccine came from, because remember, cowpox comes from a cow. The word vacca is Latin for cow, so that's where vaccine came from. Eventually, smallpox vaccinations became mandatory in Massachusetts. It's funny how they went from we don't want it to everybody got to have it. Did Onesimus live to see the success of his technique? It isn't clear. Nothing is known of his later life other than that he partially purchased his freedom. What is clear is that the knowledge that he passed on saved hundreds of lives and led to the eventual eradication of smallpox. The treated patient would develop pustules identical to those caused by naturally occurring smallpox, only they produced a much less severe disease than the naturally acquired one, and the body could mount a defense against it and would be forever immune to it. Eventually, after about 2 or 4 weeks, the symptoms would subside, indicating full recovery and lifelong immunity. Of course, we don't use that method anymore. It has been replaced by smallpox vaccine, the safer alternative, led of other vaccines, including COVID. A couple of clarifying points. The word immune comes from the Latin word immunis, which means exempt from public service. So an immunity makes you exempt from from the disease. The CDC says a vaccine is a product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity against a specific disease, protecting that person from that disease. Vaccination employs vaccines to stimulate the body's own immune system to protect the person against subsequent infection or disease. A person can become exempt to the disease when his body is exposed to it and develops antibodies to fight it. The exposure can occur either through vaccination or through getting the disease. The process that we're speaking of is called the adaptive immune response. The adaptive immune response not only attacks and neutralizes that specific pathogen, but it leaves behind memory cells to relaunch an attack should the pathogen or troublemaker return. Again, the length of the protection varies individually and per disease. Cowpox did not last as long as smallpox variolation, but it gave them years of protection against getting the smallpox. We don't know how long COVID vaccine is going to last in the system, but it does give us some time to get better at protecting ourselves. An example of a vaccine that lasts just a brief amount of time is tetanus. Do you remember? You have to get your tetanus shot approximately every 10 years, I believe. So the immunity may vary. And so we're going to do the research, determine when and how long this protection lasts. Last point, when enough people in the community are vaccinated, it can provide protection even to those who have not been vaccinated. The illustration I want to use is, think of a creek with stones going across the creek, and you use the stones to walk across the creek. Well, imagine if you go back and you take out 75% of those stones, well, then COVID can't get across the creek. That's why we're trying to get at least 75% of the population to do the vaccination so that the community can be safe. We can remove the stones and stop the vulnerability. So again, the vaccination is your concertina wire inside the basement window that keeps the COVID from coming in, causing distress, destruction, and loss of life. I don't even want to lose my sense of smell for 2 or 3 months. So that's why a couple weeks ago, I got my COVID vaccination. So did my wife.
I got it.
All right, you activate immunity. Exactly.
Please understand, the decision about whether to get your immunization is yours. You get to choose for what you're going to do with your body. God has made you in charge of yourself, and you're responsible for that. Consider, pray, decide. God bless.